Corporate personhood is one of the greatest threats to democracy that we have ever had to deal with in this country, and most people have never even heard about it. So we're on a mission to change that. Corporate personhood is a legal phenomenon. It's a legal reality under which corporations have constitutional rights. Here are just a few of the consequences of it to give you a sense of why we care about this, and then we'll dive into more of the detailed information to tell you about it. Corporations, most people are aware, can give practically unlimited political contributions to political candidates and to political parties. And the reason that they can do this is because they're called corporate persons underneath the law. And as persons, they have free speech rights. And because of that, speech is considered, spending money is a form of expressing your free speech. Ergo, they can give as much as they want to political candidates. Over the last 2+ centuries in the United States, we have developed an enormous body of anti-democratic law that is about defining who and what is a person underneath the law. So that's the basic story that we're here to tell. So starting with the Constitution, and we start there because the Constitution is the foundation of all law in the United States. And it's a pretty simple document. So what we have is this very simple diagram. There are only two entities that are mentioned in the Constitution. We the people is one of them, and the government is the other. And what the structure says is that we the people are sovereign, and this was a big deal in the 1780s, because up until then, the only sovereigns that had been around were kings and queens. And the word sovereign meant they rule. Whatever they said went. So our big idea is now we the people are going to rule instead of kings and queens. And also we have rights. The people have rights that are protected in the Constitution. Then there's a line, and on the other side of the line is the government. The government is accountable to the people, and the government has duties to perform to the satisfaction of the people. Pretty basic, simple thing. Under a system of representative democracy, there's nothing wrong with this. The other word that doesn't appear in the Constitution is the word corporation. And there's a pretty specific reason that that is the case as well. In colonial times, corporations were tools of the king's oppression. Corporations were chartered by the crown heads of Europe. In the case of England, which was the biggest impact on us here in the U.S., they were created by Parliament and approved by the king. And corporations were created in order to suck wealth out of the so-called New World and line the pockets of the European aristocracy. And they created these joint stock corporations because they needed to share the risk. It was a truly risky venture to go colonize in the Americas. And so they shared the risk with their joint stock corporations. They called them things like the Hudson Bay Company and the British East India Company and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, all these corporations that we learned about in school, only I don't remember them calling them corporations when I was back in 4th grade, but that's what they were. And their purpose was to suck wealth out and make the Europeans richer, the rich Europeans richer. So they weren't popular with any of the colonists, even the rich colonists. When the Revolutionary War was over and the Founding Fathers were sitting down to write the Constitution, they said, well, we don't want corporations in our government. We're going to let the state legislatures charter corporations. And the state the reason they picked that is because the state legislatures were closest to the people. So these corporations would be carefully controlled by the people. And the state legislatures issued very specific corporate charters. They said what the corporation could do, when it could do it, where it could do it, how it could do it, how long it could do it for. All of the people who were stockholders in the corporation were personally held liable if there was any harm done in the name of the corporation. Most of the charters only lasted about 10 or 15 years, and then they expired. They weren't renewed. The most important thing that the state legislatures considered when they were deciding whether or not to grant a corporate charter was what public good is going to be served. So they did things like build a road or a canal or a bridge, something that everybody was going to be able to use once the folks had made money off of creating this thing. And when people broke the rules of those charters, the state legislatures took them away so that they couldn't do business anymore in that form. Well, that description of corporations sounds pretty different than what it does today. I mean, with all those rules, we wouldn't have had the whole Enron thing going on. So what happened in the last 2 centuries to convert corporations from these things on a very tight leash under the control of state legislatures to today? As the decades passed, the Industrial Revolution was happening in the United States. The country was growing very rapidly in population and in size. The borders were being pushed further and further west. And so what happened is, as the decades rolled along, people started to forget about the link between corporations and royal oppression. They started to forget that corporations were the tools of the king's oppression. The number of corporations gradually started to grow, and they were becoming a more and more important way of holding property and power under corporation names instead of under a person's name, like Molly Morgan owning 10,000 acres. Now it's going to be a corporation owning 10,000 acres. During the Civil War in particular, this change happened rapidly, and that's because wars change all the rules, and so the governments on both sides of the Mason-Dixon were putting in lots and lots of orders to corporations to do all the things to keep a war going. They had to buy guns and gunpowder and wagons and horses and uniforms and shoes and rations and all of these things. And so they went into big debt. More than $400 billion the Union was in debt at the end of the Civil War, and all of that was public money that was going into corporate hands. So now they're flush with all this cash. What are they doing with it? Well, they want to further those interests along. And so what they started to do with this money was to influence their local officials, bribe their local legislators. They started to hire lawyers. And with the lawyers, they did things like write new laws that they wanted the state legislatures and the federal government to consider. And they also used those lawyers to challenge the existing laws in court. And so what started to happen, state by state, just a little bit at a time, is that those corporate charters got longer and longer and longer and longer, till today. They last forever. And at the same time, liability for corporations got smaller and smaller and smaller, and the opportunities for citizens to supervise what corporations were doing also got smaller and smaller. So this was a very good strategy for building up corporate power that was happening throughout the 19th century, but especially in the second half of the 19th century. The government is very limited in what it can do to corporations. Corporations are basically ruled out of bounds. And so, as a result, we're in this situation where corporations, giant corporations, have been enabled, because of corporate personhood, to become a political vehicle. That's their real role. They may produce goods and services, but that's just a great way to distract us from paying attention to the politics, from convert us to consumers instead of citizens. Their real role is to maintain this whole system of minority rule. So we see abolishing corporate personhood as being about building democracy. That's what the real focus of our campaign is.